We've got a great episode today. This one is called Beggar's Pudding. It's a great way to use up your stale bread. Thanks for joining us. So let's go back to the 18th century for just a moment and think about food waste and issues with items like bread. Even today, we may buy a lot of bread for a particular situation, an event or something, and then it doesn't happen, and so we end up with all this bread that it goes bad. Or, it may just happen in a normal household over time. In the 18th century, food did not go to waste. You didn't want to waste your food, and so they had ways to deal with things like stale bread. Maybe you bought stale bread from the baker because he overbaked. Maybe you had stale bread in your household, but they had several different kinds of recipes that use stale bread. This one, this Beggar's Pudding, uses stale bread as the main component, so we can use that today. This particular recipe is from the Universal Cook, and it's a cookbook that was done in 1773 by John Townsend, which I thought was pretty funny. He uses a couple extra H's, but I don't. But he obviously has this great recipe. Let's get started. So let's talk about our ingredients. I've got them all set out here. Obviously, we've got our stale bread. And if you've got something nice and tough, if you don't have stale bread already, well, you'll have to leave it out and get it stale. Maybe because it does need to have some good hard texture to it. That'll make it a little bit easier to do this. Also, for another ingredient, we need hot water. So you're gonna need hot water. This might be a little less than we need, but a good 16, 20, 24 ounces of hot water. Doesn't have to be boiling. We've got ground ginger here. We also have, of course, salt. And you, of course, can't do one of these recipes without having some wonderful nutmeg to add to the flavor of this pudding. To add to the liquids, we also have some sack wine, which is like a sherry from the time period. It's a fortified wine. And there's a nice little sack wine piece that we've got in another video. I'll put a link down in the comment section below or in the description section. We also have some currants in this particular recipe, and these currants, we're going to use Zante currants, or the tiny little grape raisins is basically what they are. In the time period, some of these recipes referenced currants that were like black currants that were ribes, and other times they're talking about the raisin kind of currant. We're going to go with the raisin kind of currant in this particular recipe. We also need some sugar. It calls for Lisbon sugar. In this situation, I'm just going to use just white loaf sugar, and we're going to need some butter towards the end here to butter our dish and to put some butter on top as it's baking. Let's start mixing up the materials we need. So step one here is the bread. We need to break it into pieces that's gonna work with this. And after that, you can either slice it up, whatever way breaks up the bread most easily. And now we're gonna pour hot water over the top of this bread. And I'm gonna let this kind of soak up just for a second while I mix up the other ingredients. I'm going to just mix everything here in the currants bowl. There aren't a lot of other ingredients, at least they don't take up a lot of room necessarily. I've got probably 6 ounces of currants here. What is that, about a half a cup or so, more or less. There are no measurements in this recipe. Like so many of them, it's just sort of a guideline. There is no there's no particular amount of bread or any of these other ingredients mentioned. And many times in these recipes, even when they do mention one thing as a particular sort of quantity, none of the other ones are measured. So you're still guessing no matter what you do. I've got ground ginger, and ground ginger is one of these things. It's very, very popular in the 18th century. Obviously, we're going to need some nutmeg. I've got some salt here. It's a little bit coarse. And next up is the sack that we're going to put in here. And this is about a half a gill of sack. Again, totally guessing. And the last ingredient that needs to go in is sugar. And I've got some white sugar here. I'll just bust up into this. So we're probably at about 1/4 cup of sugar. Obviously, depending on how sweet you want this and how big your dish is, you can adjust that quantity. I'm gonna go ahead and continue to break up this sugar with with our liquids. We're gonna go back to our bread. Now that we've got that mixture, it's soaked a little bit, and now we can kind of come back in here and look at it. We can kind of mush it up. It calls for squeezing out any extra liquid, so we really have to feel about whether we put too much water in or not. And this texture feels pretty good, pretty doughy, not like we could squeeze a bunch of water out of it if we tried. And you definitely kind of have to leave it a little bit, or else it won't soften up. But since we need to mix these other ingredients, and that's what it definitely calls for in this recipe, it says you need to mix the other ingredients well with that. That means this has to be broken down to a certain extent so we can get it all mixed in properly. Okay, so now that that feels good, let's bring our currants and wine and all those spices together now, and the sugar. We can just thoroughly mix these things up. Now we can get our pie pan ready. It doesn't call for the exact item that we're gonna bake this in. I mean, in theory, you could even boil a pudding like this, but I'm not sure how that would turn out. But this one is a baked pudding. Let's get this dish all buttered up. Now we can put our mixture straight into that. He actually calls for smoothing the top of this with a spoon, but I've found that my hand works just as well, if not better. And if it's already messy, why not? You definitely have a choice here. Depending on your bread, you might want to leave this crust on like I did in part of this, or take the crust off. This will change the texture and the taste a little bit, depending on the kind of bread that you're going to be using. Last up in this recipe is to put some butter up on top. Again, I don't think he wants this drying out. And this goes into the oven. I think it calls for a slack oven. We're not to bake this really high at a real high temperature. I would guess, I've tried this one in 325 or so. You can pop this into the oven, and time-wise, about 35 minutes, maybe 45 minutes, depending on the size of your dish and the thickness of it. Let's get this one in the oven. Well, here's our Beggar's pudding, and it turned out good. It smells great coming out of the oven. And it did sprinkle a little bit of sugar on this thing, and it looks good. It's got some nice currants, nice color to it. It definitely held up in the oven. And let's find out what it tastes like. It's got a wonderful bread pudding-y kind of texture. This is real similar. It's a kind of bread pudding, but it doesn't have what, bread puddings typically have in them, milk or eggs. It's a kind of a simplistic version in some ways, in that it just has hot water that goes in with the bread, but the currants are a nice mix. The currants don't have to be there. This would still be great without it. We get the impression from the name, Beggar's Pudding, that, possibly this was at times a dish for folks that didn't have a lot of money, but all they had was stale bread, right? And you could see how you could simplify this recipe and take out some of the expensive ingredients and still have something that was tasty and a great way to turn your lemons into lemonade, as it were. Wonderful flavors. You get that, of course, that ginger in here, which was one of the lesser expensive spices, but it comes in here wonderfully. Of course, we got nutmeg, and this recipe is really, it's different than most of what we cook today. So it is this wonderful way to experience these recipes, these wonderful food items right out of the 18th century. We get to test them out, we get to taste them, we get to smell them. Such a wonderful way to experience history and to share it with other people. If you have that, thing, I'm gonna bake this and invite people over because it's something a little out of the ordinary. Wonderful dish. You can do this at an event. If you're doing it in a Dutch oven, you can do it at home. Great, wonderful, simple ingredients. You're gonna like this one. You should really try it out. I want to thank everyone for all your amazing support, for what you do for us when watching our videos or sharing them, commenting on them. It's so great. And if you're interested in what, kind of what we do here with the cooking implements, the clothing, all these things, they're available on our website and in our print catalog. I want to thank you so much for coming along with us as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century.